On the first night of February, 1953, a father in the Zeeland village of Oosterscheldekering lifted his 2-year-old daughter, Johannes Meyer, above the black water filling his house, and carried her toward the dike, while his wife and his son drowned behind him. By dawn, 1,835 people were dead across Zeeland and the low country beyond. But a nation does not answer a flood like that with grief alone. It answers with machines that do not yet exist. This is the story of the 4 ships built to stop the North Sea. To understand those ships, we have to stand in the water first, because the barrier only exists because of one terrible night. The storm came out of the northwest on the last day of January, 1953. A hurricane-force gale that drove a high spring tide straight into the narrowing funnel of the North Sea. At Vlissingen, the water climbed to 4.5 meters above the normal level, higher than anyone had ever measured. Along the islands of Zeeland and South Holland, the dikes were low, tired walls of clay and grass that had been starved of money through 5 years of war, and the lean years that followed it. A little after 3 in the morning, they began to give way, not in one place, in more than 150 places at once. The villages were asleep. In Oosterscheldekering, 305 people would never see the morning. On the island of Schouwen-Duiveland, a second flood swept in on the Sunday afternoon and drowned the people who had lived through the night, 534 of them in a single day. Cattle turned in the current down the main streets. Families climbed into their attics, then broke through onto their roofs, and waited in the freezing wind for boats that could not reach them in time. Around 100,000 people lost everything they owned in a matter of hours. The disaster did not stop at the Dutch coast. That same surge drowned 307 people in England, and took another 133 when the ferry. Princess Victoria went down in the Irish Sea. Counted across the Netherlands, England, and Belgium, together with the ships lost at sea, the toll of that one storm came to roughly 2,551. In the flooded provinces, around 72,000 people had to be pulled from their homes in the days that followed, many of them lifted straight off their rooftops. In the village of Stavenis, 1,800 meters of dike simply vanished, and more than 150 of its people died. It was the worst natural disaster to strike the Netherlands in more than 400 years. The number the country finally settled on was 1,835, counted by the National Statistics Office. But the museum that now guards the memory of the disaster carries a stranger figure on its wall. 1,835, and then a plus sign, and then a 1. That extra soul was a baby, born in the middle of the flood, who could not be registered because it was the weekend, and whose record was later lost for good. So the true toll is a number the Netherlands can no longer prove. 1,835, and 1 more. Here is the part that turns the stomach. A Rijkswaterstaat engineer named Johan van Veen had been warning about exactly this for years. Since 1937, he had written, under the pen name Dr. Cassandra, that the sea walls of the Southwest were far too low and that a catastrophe was only a matter of time. He borrowed the name of the prophet whose warnings no one believed, and no one believed him either. The money went to other things. Van Veen died of a heart attack on a train in 1959, 7 years before the first machine reached the water. He did not live to see the country prove him right. But prove him right, it did. 17 days after the flood, the government created the Delta Commission, and the Netherlands made itself a promise that still holds today. Never again. The plan was to shorten the coastline by some 700 kilometers, trading hundreds of kilometers of fragile, low dike for a handful of enormous barriers that could actually be defended, sealing the open sea arms of the delta behind them. It was written into law as the Delta Act, and it would take more than 40 years to finish. And the hardest, the deepest, the most dangerous of all of them would be the one thrown across the mouth of the Eastern Scheldt. If you want to walk this build with us, machine by machine, then subscribe to Construction Legends right now, because what these engineers chose to do next sounds, at first, completely insane. The Eastern Scheldt is not a river. It is a tidal inlet, a gap 9 kilometers wide where the North Sea pours in and back out twice every day, across shifting sandbanks and deep, scoured channels, with currents that run at a speed no swimmer could ever fight. The first plan, drawn up in the 1960s, was simple enough in principle. Close it, build a solid dam straight across the gap, and lock the sea out forever, the way the Dutch had already locked out the Zuiderzee a generation before. Work even began. 3 artificial islands were raised in the mouth of the estuary to serve as stepping stones. Roggenplaat in 1969, Neeltje Jans in 1970, and Noordland in 1971. By the end of 1973, 5 of the 9 kilometers had already been dammed. And then the country changed its mind. Behind that dam line lay one of the richest saltwater ecosystems in Europe, and living on it were the oyster and mussel farmers of Jerseke, whose beds needed the daily tide in order to breathe. A solid dam would choke the Eastern Scheldt into a dead freshwater lake and kill all of it. The fishermen had been protesting since 1954. Now the whole environmental movement rose up beside them, and in 1974, a narrow majority in Parliament voted against the closed dam. The work was stopped where it stood. Tearing down and reworking what had already been built cost more than 200 million guilders on its own. The cabinet nearly fell over it. But the argument the fishermen and the biologists made was hard to answer. Kill the tide, and you kill the nurseries where the North Sea grows its fish. You kill the oyster and mussel beds worth a fortune every year. And you turn a living arm of the sea into a stagnant pond behind a wall. The country decided the sea was worth keeping alive, even at a staggering price. So the engineers were handed an impossible instruction. Keep the land safe from the sea, but let the sea keep flowing. They could have built a wall. They were ordered instead to build a door. The answer was a barrier that stands open on ordinary days and closes only when a storm is coming. A row of 62 steel gates hung between 65 concrete piers that slide down to seal the estuary whenever the water is forecast to rise 3 meters above normal and lift again once the danger has passed. Nothing like it had ever been attempted anywhere on Earth, and the engineers were not designing for a lifetime. They were told to build something that would defend Zeeland for more than 200 years, against a storm far larger than the one that had drowned the province in 1953. Every mattress, every pier, and every gate had to be built to survive the worst night the North Sea could ever throw at the coast. And the decision to keep the tide alive turned out to be the costliest choice in the entire project. The finished barrier would end up costing roughly 6 times the original estimate for a plain dam. The oysters in the end were very expensive oysters. To build the thing, the engineers went back to Neeltje Jans, the sandbank they had already raised in the middle of the sea, and they turned it into the strangest construction site on the planet. A factory, a harbor, a dry dock sunk 15 meters below the level of the sea, covering nearly 1 square kilometer, ringed by its own dike with pumps running day and night to hold the groundwater out. On that man-made island, in that dry hole beneath the waves, they would cast the barrier one titanic piece at a time, and then carry the pieces out into the open current. But before a single piece could be set down, they had to defeat the ground itself. The floor of the Eastern Scheldt was the enemy no one could see. Under the channels lay soft sand and silt, loose and waterlogged, the kind of ground that behaves like a solid until you put weight on it, and then behaves like a liquid. Set an 18,000-ton pier down on that seabed, and it would not simply settle. Under the hammering of a storm, the packed water and sand could turn to something close to quicksand and swallow the whole structure whole. The ground had to be made dense enough to carry a load it was never built to hold. There was no machine anywhere that could do that job on the bottom of a tidal sea. So the Dutch built one, and they named it after a mussel, the Mytilus. The Mytilus was less a ship than a floating platform carrying a steel tower nearly 60 meters tall. Hanging down inside that tower were 4 enormous vibrating needles, each one more than 2 meters across and 18 meters long. The platform would move itself into position over the seabed, lower the 4 needles into the sand, and then shake them at a frequency of 25 to 30 times every second. Loose, water-filled sand holds itself up on nothing more than friction between the grains and the water trapped between them. Shake it hard enough, and the grains lose their grip and slide down into every empty space, and the trapped water is forced out. What was a loose, dangerous mass becomes a tight, locked bed that can carry a real load. The Mytilus performed that trick 4 needles at a time, driving the sand down and packing it hard all the way to a depth of 15 meters. Then it raised the needles, crept a few meters sideways, and drove them in again, and again, and again. Across the entire footprint of the future barrier, it combed the bottom of the estuary until the treacherous quicksand floor had been compressed into something solid enough to build a mountain on. It was slow, deafening, invisible work, carried out underwater against a current that never rested, and it was only the first of the 4 ships. Each one that followed was stranger than the last. Even so, the packed sand on its own was still not enough. The instant the tide began to run over that bare, compacted seabed, it would start to claw the sand out from under the piers and undermine the whole barrier. That threat has a name every hydraulic engineer fears: scour. Water moving fast enough will lift and carry sand grain by grain, and once it begins to hollow out a pocket beneath a heavy structure, it does not stop on its own. The ground had been made strong. Now the ground had to be armored against scour, and that called for the second ship, and for one of the largest carpets ever manufactured by human hands. The armor was a mattress, not a mattress as you sleep on, but a vast woven mat of willow and synthetic fabric filled with graded layers of sand and fine gravel, 36 centimeters thick and built in 3 separate layers so that water could pass up through it while the sand beneath could never wash out. The largest of these mattresses measured 42 meters wide and 200 meters long, and each one weighed hundreds of tons. Every single pier in the barrier had to come to rest on one of them, laid dead flat and true on the seabed 30 meters down in the dark. To manufacture them, the engineers built a mattress factory on Neeltje Jans, a machine that wove the layers together and rolled the finished carpet onto a huge steel reel. And to carry that reel out to sea and unroll it onto the exact patch of seabed where a pier would later stand, they built the 3rd ship, the Cardium, named after the cockle. The Cardium worked like a floating loom turned on its head. It carried the rolled mattress on a great drum at its stern, sailed out to the marked position, and paid the carpet down over the seabed as it moved, laying it at a rate of about 10 meters an hour. Divers went down to check every edge. The mats had to overlap and line up to a tolerance measured in centimeters, because a single gap left under a pier was an open invitation for the current to start digging. The mattresses let the water seep harmlessly up through the graded gravel, while trapping the fine sand underneath, so the seabed beneath each pier could never be quietly stolen away by the tide. The Cardium was the most complicated vessel in the whole fleet, and it showed up in the bill, It cost 80% more than the engineers had ever budgeted for it. A quick word here for anyone watching this on a television. You do not need a phone in your hand to subscribe to us. Point your remote at our channel name on the screen, open the channel, and press the subscribe button right there. It is the thing that keeps documentaries like this one coming, and it does not cost you a single cent. By the time the seabed was both compacted and carpeted, the floor of the estuary had been rebuilt by human beings into a foundation strong enough to hold a range of concrete mountains, which was a very good thing, because over on Mytilus, in that dry hole below the sea, the mountains were already being poured. 65 piers hold the barrier up, and every one of them is an enormous building in its own right. They stand between 30 and nearly 39 meters tall, each pier cast to a slightly different height to match the exact depth of the channel it would guard. And each one weighs 18,000 tons. That is 18 million kilograms of steel-reinforced concrete in a single solid block, and the barrier needed 65 of them, standing in a row across the sea. They were cast upright in the dry dock on Mytilus, rank after rank of them, like headstones built for giants. A brand new pier was started every 2 weeks, and each one took roughly a year and a half to cure to full strength, which meant that at the busiest moment, around 30 of them stood together in the dock at once in every stage of completion. Between 1979 and 1983, that one site swallowed 450,000 cubic meters of concrete. Each pier had to be poured in a continuous, carefully controlled sequence, because a cold joint, a place where fresh concrete met concrete that had already begun to set, would leave a line of weakness in a structure that could never be allowed to crack. The piers were not simple columns either. Cast into the sides of each one were the vertical slots that the steel gates would one day slide down through, and those slots had to be shaped to a tolerance of millimeters in a block the size of an apartment tower, because a gate that jammed halfway was a gate that could not seal against a storm. The engineers cast one pier more than they actually needed, 66 in total, and they simply left the spare standing where it was built. It is still there on the island today, and the state now rents it out as a climbing wall. The piers were only the uprights. To turn a row of 65 towers into a solid wall, the engineers also cast and lowered massive concrete sill beams onto the seabed between the piers, and heavy box girders across the top of them, so that the finished barrier is a complete threshold of concrete, sealed from the floor of the sea to the road deck above. Every one of those pieces, too, had to be floated out and set down in the current, with the same brutal precision as the piers themselves. Then came the moment that sounds like pure madness. Once the piers were finished, the engineers cut a channel through the dike that had kept the dock bone dry for years, and let the North Sea flood into the hole they had spent so long fighting to keep empty. They drowned their own construction site, on purpose, because the only way on Earth to move an 18,000-ton pier was to float a ship in over the top of it, and the ship that would lift those piers up out of the flooded dock and carry them out into the racing estuary was the strangest machine of them all. If a machine so strange it needed the whole sea flooded around, it makes you want to see how this ends, then subscribe, because we are only halfway across the estuary, and the hardest lift of the entire build is still to come. The ship was called the Oosterscheldekering, after the oyster, and it was the flagship of the fleet. It was built in Rotterdam for around 72 million guilders, a self-propelled lifting vessel 87 meters long, driven by 4 screw propellers so that it could hold its exact position in any direction against the pull of the tide. Across its open, horseshoe-shaped hull rose 2 great steel portals, and from those portals, it could grip a load off the seabed and hold it slung in the water beneath its own belly. And here is the number that makes engineers grin. The Oosterscheldekering could lift 10,000 tons. The piers it had to move weighed 18,000. On paper, the ship could not even carry its own cargo. The answer was water. A pier hanging beneath the surface is buoyed up by everything it displaces, so the ship never had to bear the full dead weight. Buoyancy quietly paid the difference between what the ship could lift and what the pier truly weighed. To place a pier, the Austrea would sail into the flooded dock, straddle it, grip it, and raise it just clear of the bottom. Then it would carry the pier out into the estuary, to a spot marked over a mattress on the seabed 30 meters below the keel, and it would begin to lower 18 million kilograms of concrete down onto a target it could not see, in a current running at several knots, with an allowed error of only a few centimeters. A few centimeters, on a block that weighs as much as a heavy cruiser. Getting that right took a second ship working in perfect lockstep, the Makoma, named after a small clam. The Makoma was, in the plainest terms, a gigantic underwater vacuum cleaner. It coupled onto the Austrea with a grip force of 600 tons, and in the final seconds before a pier came down, it swept its suction pipe back and forth across the mattress to clear away the last thin film of sand the tide had dragged over the carpet since the day it was laid. The current never once stopped moving sand, so the cleaning had to happen at the very last possible moment, with 18,000 tons of concrete already hanging in the water directly overhead. There was no second chance in that moment. If the pier came down even slightly crooked, or dropped onto a patch of mat the Makoma had not swept clean, the flaw could not simply be lifted out and fixed. One bad placement could ruin a piece of a barrier that was meant to stand for more than 200 years. And it could only be done inside a narrow window. The current in the Eastern Scheldt runs hardest on the ebb and the flood, and eases for a short spell around the turn of the tide. That brief lull was the only moment calm enough to lower a pier with any hope of precision, so the whole operation, the ship, the vacuum, the divers, and the lasers, had to be timed to the swing of the sea itself. Miss the window, and every one of them waited for the next one. To aim all of this, the engineers used laser reference beams shot from fixed points on land, 9 separate anchor lines of Kevlar to pin each ship steady, and a sonar system adapted from the ultrasound machines used in hospitals so that they could read the shape of the seabed in the black water below. 70 to 80 divers worked the bottom by hand, checking the mats and guiding the piers home, down in cold, fast, low-visibility water where a single mistake could kill a man in a heartbeat. They worked in shifts around the clock, because the barrier could not wait, and the sea would not either. On the 11th of August, 1983, the Austrea set down the very first pier. 65 times it made that journey out from the drowned dock with a pier slung beneath it. 65 times it lowered 18,000 tons onto the dark seabed and got it right. Across 2 years and every last placement, it never once set a pier down wrong. With all 65 piers standing out in the open sea, the barrier finally had its skeleton. Now it needed the parts that actually move. 62 steel gates, one for every opening between the piers. The gates are not small. Each one is a wall of steel plate 42 meters wide, and depending on the depth of the channel, it closes, anywhere from 6 to 12 meters tall. The tallest and heaviest of them weigh around 480 tons apiece. They ride in the slots cast into the flanks of the piers, held on both sides, ready to slide down and seal the gap, or lift up and let the whole tide run free beneath them. Here, the popular story of the barrier gets it badly wrong, and the truth is far better. You will hear that each gate is a self-contained robot with no cables running to it, that a single worker could crank one shut by hand if the power ever failed. That is simply not how it works. Every gate is driven by 2 movement mechanisms, one mounted on each side, 124 of them in total across the whole barrier. and each mechanism is a hinged steel beam, pushed and pulled by a hydraulic cylinder, strong enough to force the gate down against the weight of a storm and haul it back up again afterward. The pumps that feed those cylinders are run by electric motors, housed in hollow concrete boxes perched on top of the piers, tucked beneath the road that crosses the barrier. And all of it answers to a central computer inside a control building on Neeltje Jans, watching the forecast hour by hour, backed by a redundant system that will slam the gates shut automatically if the people in the room ever fail to. When the water is predicted to climb 3 meters above normal, the order goes out, and the whole 9-kilometer barrier can seal itself in about 75 minutes. To hang each of those 62 gates out in the open water, the engineers brought in a floating shear leg crane called the Tacklift 4, which lowered the steel walls down into their slots between the piers one after another. Each gate had to be threaded into place with only a narrow clearance on either side, a wall of steel the size of a house guided down between 2 concrete towers in open water. It was the final act of assembly, and the most exposed to the weather of any of them. Laid end to end, the finished barrier stretches 9 kilometers across the mouth of the estuary, and a road runs along the very top of it, carrying traffic over the 65 piers and the 62 gates so that a driver crossing from one island to the next passes, without ever knowing it, over the largest movable storm barrier the world had ever built. And then, at long last, after the islands and the dredging and the compacting and the carpets and the piers and the gates, after 10 years of work and a final cost of 2.5 billion euros in today's money, the barrier was finished. On the 4th of October, 1986, Queen Beatrix stood on Neeltje Jans and gave the command. The gates came down into the sea, and she spoke the words that are now carved into the memory of the whole country. The storm surge barrier is closed. The delta works are complete. Zeeland is safe. It was a sentence the country had waited 33 years to be able to say, since the night the water came. The North Sea, at last, had somewhere to break itself that was not a sleeping village. In the years since, the sea has tested the barrier for real. Storm after storm has driven up the Eastern Scheldt, the alarm has sounded, and the gates have come down on schedule, a few dozen times in all. And every single time, the water has broken against steel and concrete instead of against a town. The sea has tried the door. The door has held. For the people of Zeeland, that is not an abstraction. Many of them still remember 1953, or grew up with parents who did. Every time the gates come down and the water stops exactly where the concrete tells it to stop, it is an answer to a night their families never forgot. Before we walk the last of it, one small thing. Films like this take weeks of research and fact-checking to get right, to keep the record honest instead of filling every gap with an invented number. If that kind of work means something to you, there is a link below to buy us a coffee, and every single cup keeps the next story alive. But safety was not free, and it was not paid for in guilders alone. It was paid, as every great structure is paid for, partly in the lives of the people who built it. Around 1,900 people worked on Neeltje Jans at the height of the construction, and for a project of that scale and that danger, the human toll was mercifully low. 6 of those men did not go home. Harry Loof in 1972, Jan Smalheer in 1975, Cheese Mulder in 1978, Cornelis Schilperoort on Christmas Eve of 1980, Edward Loken in 1983, and Georgios Stambolidis, a Greek worker far from home, in December of 1985, less than a year before the Queen gave her command. A truck driver killed in a crash, a man run down on the site, a crane operator. 6 names kept ever since by the people of Zeeland, for the men who helped build the wall that holds the water back, and did not live to watch it hold. And then there were the machines, the strange, brilliant, one-of-a-kind ships that had made the impossible barrier possible now had nowhere left to go. They had each been built for a single job, and the job was done. There was a quiet joke buried in their names. Every one of the 4 ships built to fight the sea had been named after a creature that lives in it: a mussel, a cockle, an oyster, and a small clam. The Dutch had built themselves a fleet of shellfish to hold back the water that shellfish are born in. The Ostrea, the oyster, the flagship that had set every last pier into the floor of the sea, worked for barely 13 months in all. In 1989, only 3 years after the barrier opened, it was towed away and cut apart for scrap. The machine that built a wonder of the modern world was sold off for the value of its steel. 1 or 2 of the others found scattered second lives, but the fleet as a whole was never used again, because nothing quite like their task ever came up twice. Because the barrier truly is exactly that. The American Society of Civil Engineers named the Delta Works, together with the older works that had closed off the Zuiderzee, one of the 7 wonders of the modern world. The Eastern Scheldt barrier is the crown of that whole achievement, the piece so utterly unlike anything built before it that people took to calling it the 8th wonder of the world. Today, the tide still floods in and out through the Eastern Scheldt, twice a day, every day, because the fishermen won their long fight, and the oyster beds still breathe. There is a price even for that victory. With the barrier slowing the water, the currents no longer carry in enough sand to feed the great mudflats and sandbanks inside the estuary, and slowly, year by year, they are being nibbled away by a hunger the engineers never foresaw, so that fresh sand now has to be added back by hand. The sea, it turns out, keeps its own books, and the knowledge that raised this barrier did not stay in Zeeland. Dutch engineers now sell it to every low-lying coast on Earth that the rising water has begun to threaten, from New Orleans to Jakarta. The lesson the Netherlands paid for in 1953, in 1,835 lives, and 1 more, is now the world's to borrow. The gates hang open above the water, waiting, and on the artificial island where all 65 piers were cast, there is a plaque, set there by the poet Ed Lieflang, and it carries a single line. Here, the tide is ruled by the moon, the wind, and us. That is the whole story in 11 words. The sea was never truly beaten. It was only one storm at a time, outvoted by the moon, by the wind, and by 4 strange ships that no longer exist.